Sometimes the people we push away are the very ones holding our future in their hands. The rain came down hard over West Baltimore, turning the cracked sidewalks into mirrors of flashing ambulance lights and neon signs that buzzed against the dark. Outside the Jefferson Community Free Clinic, a line of patients stretched past the corner despite the cold November wind. Mothers held coughing children under thin umbrellas. Elderly men leaned on canes wrapped in duct tape. Somewhere near the back of the line, a baby cried, while sirens echoed 3 blocks away. Inside the clinic, the air smelled like antiseptic, wet jackets, and burnt coffee that had been sitting too long on the warmer. Nurses moved quickly between crowded chairs while volunteers handed out clipboards and paper cups of water. In the middle of the chaos sat a quiet black man in a faded grey coat, his sleeves damp from the rain. He kept his head lowered as he helped an older woman adjust the oxygen tube beneath her nose. "Easy now," he told her softly, his voice calm enough to quiet her shaking hands. Most people barely noticed him. He didn't look important. No expensive watch, no polished shoes, no white coat hanging from his shoulders. Just tired eyes behind thin glasses and a weathered leather medical bag resting near his feet. Dr. Isaiah Brooks preferred it that way. He had spent the last 12 hours driving through neighborhoods most hospitals ignored, checking blood pressure, refilling medications, and treating patients who hadn't seen a doctor in years. The free clinic was his final stop before heading home to get maybe 3 hours of sleep before doing it all again tomorrow. But tonight, exhaustion sat heavy on him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a clipboard. Though he hid it quickly before anyone noticed, across the room, Nurse Hannah Miller watched him with concern. "You need to sit down for once," she whispered as she passed by. Isaiah gave her a faint smile. "People here have waited longer than I have." Before Hannah could answer, the front doors burst open. A blast of cold wind swept through the lobby as Officer Caleb Turner stepped inside with rain dripping from his uniform jacket. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the kind of presence that made conversations stop mid-sentence, Caleb scanned the crowded room with narrowed eyes, already searching for a problem. "We got a complaint about someone harassing patients," he announced sharply. The room fell quiet. A mother pulled her child closer. A volunteer looked down at the floor. Caleb's gaze moved from face to face until it landed on Isaiah beside the waiting chairs. The medical bag, the worn clothes, the quiet silence. In Caleb's mind, the picture was already complete. "You," he said, pointing across the room. "Stand up." Isaiah slowly rose to his feet, calm despite dozens of eyes turning toward him. "Is there a problem?" Officer Caleb walked closer, jaw tight. "I asked you a question first. Patients say you've been bothering people." Hannah immediately stepped forward. "Officer, he works. I wasn't talking to you." Caleb snapped without even looking at her. The clinic went still again. Isaiah kept his expression steady. But the humiliation spread through the room like smoke. Caleb gestured toward the door. "This clinic's for people getting treatment, not loiterers pretending to belong here." A few uncomfortable whispers rose from the waiting area. Isaiah glanced briefly at the frightened patients around him before picking up his weathered bag. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly, but Caleb was already moving closer, guiding him toward the exit in front of everyone. And as the rain hammered against the windows and the entire clinic watched in silence, Isaiah looked at the officer with tired eyes and spoke in a voice so calm it almost disappeared beneath the storm. Pray you never need mercy from someone you refuse to recognize. The automatic doors shut behind Isaiah with a dull metallic thud. And just like that, the warmth of the clinic disappeared. Cold rain soaked through his coat almost instantly as he stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the flickering streetlight. Behind the glass doors, he could still see frightened patients watching him leave, their faces half hidden by reflections of ambulance lights and streaks of rainwater. Officer Caleb Turner stood near the entrance with his arms crossed. Convinced he had restored order, to him, the situation was simple. A crowded clinic, nervous patients, a suspicious man without identification visible, Problemhändler, but inside the waiting room, the silence he left behind did not feel like safety. It felt heavy. Nurse Hannah Miller rushed toward the front desk, frustration written across her face. "Do you even realize who that man is?" she whispered sharply to the volunteer beside her. The young volunteer shook his head nervously. Hannah looked back toward the rain outside, her jaw tightening. That man has probably saved more lives in this neighborhood than anyone in this building. Outside, Isaiah adjusted the strap of his worn medical bag and started walking through puddles collecting near the curb. His breathing was slower now, measured, but exhaustion dragged behind every step. He reached the old blue outreach van parked beside the alley and paused for a moment. One hand pressed quietly against the center of his chest. The pain passed after a few seconds, and he exhaled softly before climbing inside. The dashboard clock read 1147 p.m. 12 missed calls blinked on his phone screen. 3 from Mercy General Hospital. 2 from his daughter Maya. The rest from nurses and clinic coordinators across the city. Isaiah rubbed his tired eyes before finally calling Maya back. "Dad." Her voice answered immediately, filled with worry. "You promised you would be home hours ago." Isaiah smiled faintly despite himself. "I know. You sound exhausted." "Long night." Maya hesitated for a second before speaking again. "You cannot keep doing this to yourself. You already worked 3 surgeries this week." Isaiah looked through the rain-covered windshield toward the glowing clinic sign across the street. "People need help." Maya's voice softened. "And who helps you?" He did not answer right away. Across the sidewalk, Officer Caleb Turner remained near the clinic entrance, speaking with another officer while sipping from a large gas station coffee cup. Even from a distance, Isaiah could hear the irritation in Caleb's voice. "You give people an inch around here, they take a mile." Caleb muttered. "Half the time nobody even knows who belongs in these places anymore." The younger officer beside him nodded awkwardly but said nothing. Caleb had built a reputation inside the department for being aggressive but effective. He answered calls fast, filed reports on time, and never backed down once he believed he was right. But over the years, something inside him had hardened. Every long shift, every domestic call, every overdose scene, every lie from people he arrested had slowly stripped away his patience until suspicion became instinct. He no longer saw individuals. He saw threats, disruptions, problems waiting to happen. And tonight, Isaiah Brooks had simply fit the picture in his mind before a single word was spoken. Caleb took another drink of coffee, then suddenly winced. His hand pressed briefly against his chest beneath the wet uniform jacket. Just pressure. He told himself. Too much caffeine. Too little sleep. The feeling faded after a moment. Across the street, Isaiah watched silently from inside the outreach van. Not with anger, not even resentment. Just quiet observation. Then he started the engine. The old van rattled loudly before pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the rain-soaked streets of West Baltimore, while behind him the clinic lights continued glowing against the storm. And somewhere deep inside Officer Caleb Turner, a clock had already started ticking. By 6:30 the next morning, West Baltimore looked washed out beneath a grey winter sky. Steam drifted from manhole covers, while city buses groaned through crowded intersections, carrying exhausted workers into another cold day. Inside Mercy General Hospital, fluorescent lights hummed softly above polished floors that smelled faintly of bleach and stale coffee. Nurses moved quickly between patient rooms. Monitors beeped in uneven rhythms. And somewhere down the hall, a tired janitor pushed a mop bucket past the emergency department doors. Dr. Isaiah Brooks stood alone at a sink inside operating room 3, scrubbing his hands in silence. The exhaustion from the night before still lingered beneath his eyes. But once he stepped inside a hospital, something in him always changed. The quiet man from the free clinic disappeared, replaced by someone precise, calm, and completely in control. A young surgical resident beside him glanced nervously at a chart. 47-year-old male. The resident said, "Severe arterial blockage. Blood pressure unstable." Isaiah nodded once without looking up. How long has he been waiting? Almost 4 hours. 2 surgeons already refused the case. Isaiah reached for a towel, then let us stop wasting more time. Around the operating floor, people moved differently when he spoke. Nurses straightened. Residents listened carefully. Even veteran staff carried themselves with more focus once Isaiah entered the room. He had earned that kind of respect over 20 years inside hospitals where pressure crushed weaker people. Some doctors relied on ego. Isaiah relied on discipline. He never raised his voice, never panicked, never forgot that frightened people were trusting him with their lives. Downstairs in the hospital cafeteria, Nurse Hannah Miller sat scrolling through overnight clinic reports while stirring sugar into burnt coffee. Her frustration from the night before had not faded. Across from her sat clinic director Grace Whitman. Still shaken by what happened with Officer Caleb Turner, "I should have stopped it," Grace whispered. Hannah looked up sharply. "You tried." "Not enough." Grace lowered her eyes. "Isaiah volunteers more hours than anyone we have. Half the neighborhood trusts that clinic because of him." Hannah leaned back in her chair. "People see an old coat and tired shoes and think they know somebody's worth." Grace stared quietly toward the television, mounted in the cafeteria corner where morning news rolled across the screen. Another shooting, another overdose. Another story about neighborhoods everyone promised to fix, but never truly did. "Do you think he is angry?" Grace finally asked. Hannah gave a small, sad smile. "That is the thing about Isaiah. He does not carry anger the way most people do." Upstairs, Isaiah finished surgery after nearly 3 hours without taking a single break. The patient survived. As he removed his gloves, the surgical resident shook his head in disbelief. I still do not understand how you stayed calm through all of that. Isaiah placed the surgical mask aside carefully. Fear spreads fast inside a room like that. He answered quietly. If the doctor loses control, everybody else follows. Before the resident could reply, Isaiah's phone buzzed inside his locker. 3 missed calls again from Maya, another from the free clinic, and 1 emergency alert from hospital administration requesting all trauma surgeons remain available due to worsening weather conditions across the city. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly. His body begged for rest. But the day was far from over. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Officer Caleb Turner sat inside his patrol car beneath a flickering traffic light, rubbing at the tightness spreading slowly through his chest. Empty energy drink cans cluttered the passenger seat beside fast food wrappers from another skipped meal. Dispatch chatter crackled through the radio while rain tapped softly against the windshield. Caleb adjusted his vest and forced himself upright. He ignored the pressure in his chest the same way he ignored most things lately. Sleep, stress, headaches, loneliness, regret. The city did not care if he was tired. The badge demanded he keep moving. But somewhere deep beneath the noise of police sirens and radio calls, the memory of the quiet man outside the clinic kept returning to him. Pray you never need mercy from someone you refuse to recognize. Caleb scoffed under his breath and reached for the ignition key, unaware that before the sun set again, those words would become the most terrifying sentence he had ever heard. The afternoon sky darkened early over Baltimore. Thick clouds pressing low above rows of aging brick buildings, while freezing rain turned the streets slick with reflections of red brake lights and convenience store signs. Traffic crawled through intersections packed with delivery trucks, city buses, and impatient drivers leaning on their horns. Officer Caleb Turner sat behind the wheel of his patrol car outside a gas station on Fremont Avenue, staring blankly at the radio mounted near the dashboard, while dispatch calls blurred together into noise. Domestic disturbance on the west side. Shoplifting downtown. Suspicious person near Lexington Market. The city never stopped asking for more. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face and glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The dark circles beneath his eyes looked worse than usual. He had barely slept 3 hours after his shift ended the night before. Even now, the pressure inside his chest kept returning in short waves that spread into his left shoulder before fading again. He told himself it was stress. Too much caffeine. Too many years working double shifts without slowing down. Across the street, teenagers hurried through the rain with backpacks over their heads, while an elderly man pushed a shopping cart wrapped in plastic bags. Caleb watched them through the windshield without really seeing them. Somewhere along the line, the city had become one endless problem to manage instead of people trying to survive. His radio crackled again. Unit 12. Respond to traffic collision on East Monroe. Caleb grabbed the microphone automatically. Copy that. He started the engine and pulled into traffic. Wipers, pushing sheets of rain aside while the siren lights reflected off soaked pavement. But halfway through the intersection near Monroe and Pulaski, the pain hit him harder than before. Sharp, sorta deep enough to steal the air from his lungs. Caleb's hand tightened around the steering wheel as dizziness rushed through him. The patrol car drifted slightly before he corrected it. Come on, he muttered through clenched teeth. Sweat formed along his forehead despite the cold. He tried taking a slow breath, but another wave crashed through his chest. stronger this time. His vision blurred around the edges, the city lights outside smeared together into streaks of red and white. For the first time in years, fear crept into him. Real fear, not the kind officers joked about after dangerous calls. This was different. Quiet, personal, the kind that arrived when your own body stopped listening to you. Caleb pulled the patrol car sharply toward the curb beside a closed laundromat. Rain hammered the roof, while passing traffic splashed water against the tires. His breathing became shallow and uneven. The radio kept talking somewhere beside him. But the voices sounded far away now. Then his hands slipped from the steering wheel. Across town, inside Mercy General Hospital, Isaiah Brooks sat alone in a dim office finishing patient notes while cold coffee sat untouched beside stacks of charts. His reading glasses rested low on his nose as thunder rolled faintly outside the windows. He had not gone home yet. Another trauma consult had arrived 30 minutes earlier. Another emergency surgery might come before midnight. The hospital never truly slept. A young nurse suddenly appeared breathless at his doorway. "Dr. Brooks," she said quickly. "Emergency department just received a police officer in cardiac distress. They are asking for cardiothoracic immediately." Isaiah removed his glasses slowly. "Who is on call?" "Dr. Feldman is stuck in surgery, and Dr. Chen is still 40 minutes away because of the storm." The nurse hesitated before adding quietly, "You are the only attending surgeon in the building qualified for this procedure right now." Isaiah stood without speaking. The exhaustion in his body remained, but years of discipline took over instantly. He grabbed his white coat from the chair beside him and followed the nurse through crowded hallways filled with rushing footsteps and overhead announcements. Downstairs in the emergency department, paramedics rolled Officer Caleb Turner through sliding doors beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while rainwater dripped from his uniform onto the floor. His face had gone pale now, his breathing shallow. Nurses moved quickly around him as monitors screamed sharp warning tones into the chaos. Then, through the blur of fear and fading consciousness, Caleb looked up toward the trauma bay entrance just as a familiar figure stepped through the doors, wearing a white coat with the name Dr. Isaiah Brooks stitched clearly across the chest. The emergency department moved like controlled chaos beneath bright fluorescent lights that reflected against polished floors still wet from paramedics rushing through the storm. Nurses pushed carts between trauma bays, while overhead speakers called out incoming emergencies in sharp mechanical voices. Somewhere nearby, a child cried behind a curtain. Somewhere else, a heart monitor released a long, steady tone before suddenly returning to rhythm. But inside Trauma Room 2, everything narrowed to one bed. Officer Caleb Turner lay partially conscious beneath harsh white light. His soaked uniform cut open around the chest while medical staff worked quickly around him. Oxygen hissed softly through a mask, covering his face. Electrocardiogram lines jumped unevenly across the monitor beside him. Fear sat visibly in his eyes now. Replacing the confidence he usually carried behind a badge, for the first time in years, Caleb was no longer the man giving orders. He was simply a patient watching strangers decide whether he lived or died. Then Dr. Isaiah Brooks stepped closer to the bedside. The room shifted the moment he entered. Nurses straightened instinctively. A resident hurried to hand him the chart. Another doctor moved aside without being asked. Isaiah's calm presence spread through the trauma bay like quiet gravity, pulling panic back under control. Caleb stared at the stitched letters on the white coat. Dr. Isaiah Brooks. The same man standing in front of him now, with steady hands and tired eyes, was the man he had pushed out into the rain less than 24 hours earlier. Caleb tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled his words into broken breaths. Isaiah scanned the chart carefully without reacting. Elevated enzymes, severe arterial blockage, internal cardiac damage worsening by the minute. His expression remained composed. Though Nurse Hannah Miller, standing nearby, saw the faint tension pass through his jaw, she had rushed downstairs the second she heard the patient's name. Now she watched silently as the two men faced each other again under completely different circumstances. One powerless, the other holding every ounce of control. "Prepare operating room 4. Isaiah said calmly. "We do not have much time." A young resident looked uncertain. "Dr. Brooks, the blockage is extensive. If we wait for Dr. Chen, he will not make it. If we wait—" Isaiah answered quietly. No anger, no hesitation, just fact. Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on him. Shame settled slowly across his face as recognition fully sank in. The memory of rain hitting the clinic windows, the frightened patients watching, the words he had spoken with certainty and contempt. This clinic is for people getting treatment, not loiterers pretending to belong here. Now the man he refused to recognize was the only reason doctors were still fighting for his life. Isaiah finally looked directly at Caleb for the first time since entering the room. Their eyes locked for several long seconds while the sounds of the emergency department blurred into distant noise around them. Caleb's breathing trembled beneath the oxygen mask. "Doctor," he managed weakly, before coughing against the pressure in his chest. Isaiah stepped closer so he could hear him. Caleb swallowed hard. "I did not know." The sentence broke apart beneath exhaustion and fear. Isaiah remained still for a moment. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used at the clinic. "No," he said quietly. "You only decided who I was before you ever asked." The words landed heavier than anger ever could. Around them, even the nurses seemed to pause briefly beneath the weight of that truth. Caleb closed his eyes for a second as humiliation spread through him deeper than the pain in his chest. Not because Isaiah embarrassed him publicly, not because anyone shouted at him, but because the man he had judged so quickly was still choosing to save him anyway. Hannah watched Isaiah carefully as he signed emergency surgical authorization forms. She knew him well enough to understand what this moment cost him emotionally. Mercy sounded beautiful in stories. In real life, mercy demanded restraint when pride wanted revenge. Another alarm suddenly sounded from Caleb's monitor. The rhythm became more unstable. A nurse looked up urgently. "Dr. Brooks, we are losing pressure." Isaiah immediately snapped back into motion. "Move now," he ordered. Staff pushed the bed rapidly toward the operating wing, while rain slammed harder against hospital windows overlooking the city. And as Caleb disappeared down the hallway beneath cold fluorescent lights, one terrifying realization settled fully into his heart. The quiet man he once threw into the storm was now the only thing standing between him and death. Operating room 4 felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Bright surgical lights hung over and like white suns, while stainless steel instruments reflected sharp flashes across the room. The steady rhythm of heart monitors blended with the low hum of machines and the quiet movement of masked nurses preparing trays beneath the pressure of limited time. Outside the operating room windows, rain continued pouring over Baltimore, washing the city beneath gray darkness that seemed endless. Dr. Isaiah Brooks stood at the surgical sink once again. Water running over exhausted hands that had already spent nearly 15 hours saving lives without rest. His shoulders ached beneath the weight of fatigue. But his expression never changed. Discipline had carried him through nights, far worse than this one. Beside him, Nurse Hannah Miller adjusted her mask carefully before speaking in a low voice. "You do not have to do this alone," she said gently. Isaiah dried his hands slowly. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I do." Hannah studied him for a moment. After what happened at the clinic, Isaiah finally looked up at her through the mirror above the sink. "If I let another man's ignorance decide who deserves care," he said calmly, "then I become part of the same sickness." The words settled heavily between them. Hannah lowered her eyes. Understanding immediately. Inside the operating room, Caleb Turner drifted in and out of consciousness beneath harsh light and medication haze. The fear inside him had changed now. Earlier, he feared dying. But as doctors prepared the surgery, another fear began growing deeper. The realization that his entire understanding of people had failed him. He remembered Isaiah standing quietly beside frightened patients while he assumed the worst without evidence. He remembered the rain soaking through that faded grey coat while he spoke with the confidence of a man certain he knew who belonged and who did not. Now, every memory returned sharper than before. One of the anesthesiologists adjusted Caleb's oxygen mask, while another nurse checked intravenous lines. "Dr. Brooks is ready," someone said near the doorway. Caleb's eyes shifted weakly toward the entrance as Isaiah walked in wearing surgical blue beneath his white coat. Calm, focused, controlled. Nothing about him suggested revenge or bitterness. And somehow, that hurt Caleb more than anger would have. A younger surgical resident quietly whispered to another nurse nearby. Unaware, Caleb could still hear fragments of the conversation. "That is," Isaiah Brooks, the resident, asked softly. "The Isaiah Brooks," the nurse nodded immediately. "One of the best cardiothoracic surgeons in the state. He trained at Johns Hopkins, turned down private hospitals worth millions just to stay here." The resident looked stunned. "Then why does he spend nights volunteering at free clinics?" The nurse glanced toward Isaiah before answering. "Because his younger brother died waiting for treatment when they were kids." Silence followed those words, even through the medication haze. Caleb felt something inside him collapse quietly. He had looked at a man carrying decades of sacrifice, vrif, intelligence, and service to the community, and reduced him to a stereotype within seconds. Not because of evidence, not because of behavior, simply because Caleb had stopped seeing humanity before he ever saw people. Isaiah stepped beside the operating table and reviewed the final scans carefully. Severe coronary damage, critical narrowing, complicated but survivable if everything went perfectly. The resident nearby swallowed nervously. "Dr. Brooks," he asked carefully, "after everything that happened between you two, how are you staying this calm?" Isaiah remained focused on the scans for several seconds before answering. "Because this room is not about my pride," he said quietly. "It is about his life." No speech could have carried more weight than those simple words. Around the room, nurses exchanged silent glances, while the storm rattled faintly against hospital windows high above the city. Caleb stared at the ceiling lights as shame settled deeper into him than any physical pain. For years, he had worn authority like armor. Believing control made him strong. But lying helpless beneath those lights he finally understood something terrifying. The strongest man in the room was not the one carrying a badge. It was the quiet man who still chose compassion after being humiliated in front of an entire clinic. Isaiah pulled on his surgical gloves while monitors continued their uneven rhythm beside the operating table. Then he looked directly at Caleb one final time before the anesthesia fully took effect. "Stay with us," he said calmly. "You still have time to become better than the man you were yesterday." Hours passed beneath the cold glow of surgical lights, while rain continued falling over Baltimore like the city itself was holding its breath. Inside Operating Room 4, every movement carried the weight of consequence. Machines hummed steadily. Monitors pulsed with fragile rhythm. Nurses exchanged instruments with practiced precision, while the air remained thick with focus and exhaustion. At the center of it all stood Dr. Isaiah Brooks, shoulders squared despite fatigue that had long since settled deep into his bones. Sweat formed along his forehead beneath the surgical cap. But his hands never shook. Not once. The blockage had proven worse than the scans first revealed. Complications continued appearing one after another, forcing split-second decisions that could determine whether Caleb Turner survived the night. The younger resident, assisting Isaiah, struggled to hide his anxiety. "Pressure is dropping again," he warned quietly. Another monitor released a sharp warning tone. The room tensed instantly. Isaiah remained completely still for half a second, eyes fixed on the surgical field beneath the bright lights. Calm spread outward from him, like gravity pulling chaos back into place. "Increase support flow," he instructed evenly. "Prepare the graft. No panic, no raised voice, just control." The resident obeyed immediately, while Hannah watched from across the room with admiration she could no longer hide. She had worked beside famous surgeons before. Brilliant ones. Arrogant ones. Men who treated medicine like performance. But Isaiah was different. He carried himself like every human life still mattered equally. Even when the person lying on the table had failed to see his humanity just hours earlier. Outside the operating room, several police officers gathered quietly in the surgical waiting area while coffee machines buzzed in the background. Caleb's partner, Officer Ryan Delaney, sat hunched forward with both hands clasped tightly together. He had spent years working beside Caleb. Long shifts, dangerous calls, court testimony. The kind of partnership built slowly through shared exhaustion. Yet tonight, something kept bothering him. What exactly happened at that clinic yesterday? Ryan finally asked Nurse Hannah when she stepped into the hallway for a moment. Hannah hesitated. Officer Turner removed Dr. Brooks from the building. Ryan frowned. Removed him. Hannah looked directly at him now. Publicly humiliated him in front of patients who trust him with their lives. Ryan leaned back slowly. Stunned. Jesus. Hannah folded her arms against the cold hallway air. The man inside that room volunteers almost every night in neighborhoods most people avoid after dark. Ryan stared silently through the operating room window where Isaiah moved carefully beneath white light. And he still agreed to operate. Hannah gave a tired smile filled with equal parts sadness and respect. That is who he is. Back inside surgery, another tense hour passed before Isaiah finally stepped away from the table for a brief moment. The resident looked exhausted. "I do not understand how you are still standing," he admitted quietly. Isaiah removed one glove and flexed his aching fingers once before answering. "When I was 14 years old," he said calmly. My little brother waited 11 hours in an overcrowded emergency room because nobody thought a poor black kid from West Baltimore could possibly be in serious condition. The room grew quieter around him. Even the residents stopped moving. Isaiah stared briefly toward the surgical lights above. By the time a doctor finally saw him, it was too late. Hannah lowered her eyes immediately, understanding now why Isaiah never turned anyone away from the clinic, no matter how exhausted he became. Why he treated frightened strangers with patience others no longer had. Why humiliation from one angry police officer had not hardened his heart, because Isaiah understood better than anyone what neglect could cost. He pulled his glove back on and stepped once more toward Caleb's bedside. "Let us finish this," he said softly. Another hour passed before the final monitor readings finally stabilized. The dangerous rhythm inside Caleb's chest slowly settled into something stronger, more consistent. Life returning, one fragile beat at a time. Relief spread quietly through the room. Some nurses exhaled for the first time in hours. The resident nearly sagged with exhaustion, but Isaiah simply stood there in silence, staring at the man whose life he had just saved. Not with triumph, not with revenge, just quiet reflection beneath the harsh surgical lights. Then he removed his gloves slowly and walked toward the doors, while rain continued tapping softly against hospital windows high above the sleeping city. And somewhere between those falling raindrops and the steady rhythm now beating inside Caleb Turner's chest, the balance of power between the two men had changed forever. Morning sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds above Baltimore, casting pale gold reflections across hospital windows still streaked with rain from the night before. Mercy General Hospital had quieted slightly now. The chaos of emergency surgeries and overnight trauma calls faded into softer rhythms of rolling carts, distant intercom announcements, and tired nurses exchanging shifts beneath fluorescent lights. Inside the intensive care recovery unit, Officer Caleb Turner slowly opened his eyes to the steady sound of a cardiac monitor beside his bed. His body felt heavy. Every breath carried soreness through his chest. For several long seconds, he stared blankly at the ceiling, disoriented by the antiseptic smell and the low mechanical hum surrounding him. Then memory returned all at once. The clinic, the rain, the quiet black man standing beneath flickering lights while Caleb pushed him toward the door. And then the operating room, the white coat, DRA, Isaiah Brooks. Shame hit harder now than any physical pain ever could. Caleb turned his head slowly toward the room window, where early sunlight stretched across polished floors outside. A nurse noticed he was awake and stepped inside with a gentle smile. "Good morning." "Officer Turner," she said softly. "You gave everybody a scare." Caleb swallowed painfully before speaking. "The surgeon?" His voice sounded rough and weak. "Dr. Brooks. Is he still here?" The nurse nodded. "He stayed most of the night monitoring your recovery." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Even now, after everything, Isaiah had remained. A few minutes later, the door opened quietly again. Isaiah Brooks entered, carrying a patient chart beneath one arm, dark circles still visible beneath tired eyes that had not truly rested in almost 2 days. Without the surgical cap and operating lights around him, he looked once again like the same calm man from the clinic. Simple, quiet, unassuming, but Caleb no longer saw weakness in that silence. He saw strength powerful enough to remain compassionate when bitterness would have been easier. Isaiah reviewed the monitor readings carefully before finally speaking. "Your surgery was successful," he said calmly. "Recovery will take time, but your prognosis is good if you follow treatment instructions." Caleb stared at him for several seconds, struggling to hold eye contact. "Why?" he finally whispered. Isaiah looked up from the chart. "Why?" What? Caleb's throat tightened. "Why did you still save me after what I did?" The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of the monitor beside the bed. Isaiah remained quiet for a moment before setting the chart down near the window. "Because once someone's life is in your hands," he answered softly, "you have a choice about what kind of person you want to become." Caleb felt his chest tighten again, though this time it had nothing to do with surgery. "I judged you," he admitted quietly. "I looked at you and decided you did not belong before you even spoke." Isaiah nodded slightly. "Yes." No anger, no dramatic speech. Just truth spoken plainly enough to leave nowhere to hide from it. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the blanket covering his hospital bed. "I do not know when I became that person." Isaiah walked slowly toward the window, overlooking the city streets below, where people moved through another ordinary morning, completely unaware of the conversation happening several floors above them. "Pain changes people," Isaiah said quietly. "Fear changes people too. The danger comes when we stop seeing human beings and only see assumptions." Caleb stared at him silently. For years he had believed strength meant authority, control, commanding rooms, winning confrontations. But none of that looked powerful anymore compared to the man standing beside the window. A man who had every reason to humiliate him in return, yet chose dignity instead. The door opened once more as Nurse Hannah entered carrying updated charts. She paused briefly after noticing the tension inside the room. But this time, the silence felt different, softer somehow, less like judgment and more like reckoning. Caleb looked back toward Isaiah with eyes filled not only with gratitude, but regret deep enough to change something inside him permanently. Isaiah picked up the chart again and headed toward the doorway before stopping briefly beside the bed. "Recovery is not only physical," he said calmly without turning around. "Sometimes the heart has to learn something too." Then he walked quietly out of the room, while morning sunlight continued spilling across the floor behind him. And for the first time in many years, Officer Caleb Turner sat alone with the unbearable weight of finally seeing another human being clearly. 3 weeks later, winter sunlight stretched softly across the sidewalks outside Jefferson Community Free Clinic, while neighbors lined up beneath the faded blue awning, waiting for appointments. The storm that once flooded the city had long passed, but the memory of that night still lingered quietly inside the people who witnessed it. Mothers carried children through the front doors, wrapped in thick coats against the cold. Elderly patients greeted nurses by name. Volunteers sorted, donated medicine near the reception desk, while the smell of coffee drifted through the crowded waiting room once again. And standing near the front entrance in a dark wool coat was Officer Caleb Turner. He looked different now. Thinner somehow. Quieter. The sharp arrogance that once followed him like a shadow had faded beneath something heavier. Reflection. He held a plain cardboard box carefully in both hands, while nervous eyes studied the clinic around him. Some patients recognized him immediately. A few whispers spread softly through the room. Caleb noticed them, but did not react. For the first time in years, he understood what it felt like to walk into a room carrying the weight of judgment. Near the back hallway, Nurse Hannah Miller froze briefly, after seeing him. Her expression tightened instinctively. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. Caleb swallowed once before answering. "I came to see Dr. Brooks." Hannah studied him for several seconds, unsure whether to trust the sincerity in his voice. Then she nodded slowly toward the examination rooms. "He is with a patient." Caleb thanked her quietly and stepped aside near the waiting chairs. As he waited, he watched Isaiah moving calmly from room to room, speaking gently with patients who looked at him with complete trust. A frightened mother relaxed the moment Isaiah explained her son's treatment plan. An elderly veteran shook his hand with gratitude after receiving medication he could finally afford. Nobody cared about Isaiah's old coat here. Nobody questioned whether he belonged, because in this neighborhood, people knew exactly who he was. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the cardboard box in his hands. Inside sat his police badge and resignation papers. 2 weeks earlier, Internal Affairs had opened a formal review into multiple complaints involving racial profiling and misconduct from past encounters. Caleb once dismissed as routine policing, but deep down, he knew the investigation was not the real reason. He no longer recognized himself in the mirror. The surgery had saved his life. The shame afterward changed it. Isaiah finally stepped out of an examination room while removing latex gloves. He looked tired as always, but calm in the way people become after surviving pain without letting it poison them. When he noticed Caleb standing there, he stopped briefly. Silence settled between them once more. But this silence felt different from the clinic during the storm. Back then, pride stood between them. Now only truth remained. Caleb stepped forward slowly. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. Isaiah remained still. Listening, Caleb glanced around the waiting room before continuing. "I spent years thinking authority made me better than the people I served. I stopped seeing individuals. I only saw assumptions." His voice tightened slightly. "And if you had been the kind of man I thought you were, I would be dead right now." Several patients nearby listened silently while nurses paused their work. Not because they wanted drama, but because moments like this rarely happened honestly. Caleb held out the cardboard box. "I'm stepping away from the force," he admitted. "Maybe permanently. I do not know yet. But I know I cannot wear that badge again until I understand what it truly means to protect people." Isaiah looked down at the box for a moment before speaking softly. "A badge does not decide whether someone has humanity." Caleb nodded slowly. Eyes filled with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "No," he answered. "People do." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Isaiah extended his hand calmly. Caleb stared at it in surprise before shaking it carefully. Not as an officer shaking hands with a civilian, not as a man saving face, but as two human beings finally standing on equal ground. Around them, the clinic slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Phones rang. Patients talked quietly. Outside, sunlight reflected against wet pavement left behind by melted snow. Life moved forward the way it always did. But somewhere deep inside Caleb Turner, something fundamental had shifted forever. Because sometimes justice does not arrive through punishment. Sometimes it arrives through mercy, so powerful it forces a person to confront the ugliness they spent years refusing to see. And as Isaiah turned to continue caring for patients who needed him, one truth remained hanging quietly in the air behind him. The strongest people are not the ones who hold power over others. They are the ones who still choose compassion after the world gives them every reason not